Live everywhere on netrootsradio.com. David Waldman, Kagro, in the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. It's taking me a little bit of time to get up and started. I'm virtually with you right there on Monday, June 16th. That's what we're calling it. That's what the rest of the world is calling it. I'm just matching their label for it. This, of course, a pre-recorded episode of Kagro in the Morning, and this represents our best guess at stories which were backlogged, but that might somehow still be relevant a couple days into the future. And who knows what the weekend has brought us. It's usually a little wild after the weekend anyway. But this one, of course, included Donald Trump's big military birthday party to himself, plus whatever might have happened in Los Angeles, plus whatever may have happened around the world. I don't even know. But we nonetheless have determined at the scientific labs at KITM World Headquarters that today would be the day we would bring you up to speed on some of the behind-the-scenes machinations that Dodgy was up to today and tomorrow. That Dodgy was up to when they infiltrated the various governmental departments, and who knows what happened behind the scenes there. But we have one man's opinion of it, one guy who, in fact, recently left the Dodgy service and has kind of said, yeah, I didn't really find the waste, fraud, and abuse that we were told to expect. So we'll kick off with that, a couple of articles about that guy and what he had to say, plus your usual roundup of strange fare that's been hanging around for I don't know how long that needs to get on the record. So why don't we dive right in? I don't remember how we started this thing. Let's just pretend I'm segueing on into the next story. Let's take this opportunity to catch up on another story that has been waiting in pocket for some time and now has companion pieces in more contemporary stories. This goes back to May 16th, not too far back, but there are a couple of newer stories that sort of corroborate what we learned in this one. The later stories deal mostly with the Veterans Affairs Department, but this one here is about, well, the title of it, How Dodgy's Grand Plan to Remake Social Security is Backfiring. You almost assuredly heard about this along the way at some point. The agency, we are told back in May 16th, is abandoning an initiative aimed at preventing fraud, the latest example of a failed effort by Elon Musk's disruptive cost-cutting team. This Washington Post piece brought to us by the writing team of Hannah Nathanson, Lisa Rain, R-E-I-N, and Merrill Cornfield. And they put things this way. The U.S. Dodgy Service arrived at the Social Security Administration this year, determined to slash staff and root out what it claimed was widespread fraud and wasteful spending, a mission Elon Musk's cost-cutting team had pursued across the government. But as of this week, and that was again in mid-May, many of the major changes Dodgy pushed at Social Security have been abandoned or are being reversed after proving ineffective, while others are yielding unintended consequences and badly damaging customer service and satisfaction. The problems come as the agency struggles to cope with a record surge of hundreds of thousands of retirement claims in recent months. And what do you think could have been contributing to the unusually large number of retirement claims? Dodgy, which stands for, of course, the Department of Government Efficiency. It's not any of those things, but okay. But is not a cabinet-level agency, or in fact, a department at all, had to cancel a plan to cut phone service for retirement and disability claims after drawing outrage from lawmakers, seniors, and advocates. Staff reductions and reassignments led by Dodgy are slowing the pace of claims processing as field offices lose longtime staff and gain a smaller number of inexperienced replacements. Dodgy's driven changes to the agency's website, are causing crashes almost every day, and phone customers complain about dropped calls and long wait times. A dodgy imposed spending freeze is leading to shortages of basic office supplies, from printer cartridges to the phone headsets staff need to do their jobs. And on Friday, Social Security leaders told employees that the agency was ending a security check developed at Dodgy's request that was meant to root out allegedly fraudulent claims filed over the phone, according to 3 employees familiar with the situation and an email obtained by the Washington Post. But the measure, which involved placing a 3-day hold on all phone claims as other staffers checked into the caller's background, had only identified a couple of potential fraud cases while causing significant delays in claims processing, 2 employees said. I think probably we all could have guessed that was going to be the outcome. Kathleen Romig, a former Social Security official, perhaps Romig, I'm not sure, R-O-M-I-G, former Social Security official who's now at the left-leaning, they say, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, said there were already safeguards in place to detect fraud through the agency's phone service. Dodgy's efforts have only delayed claims processing and, like most of the team's attempts to reshape Social Security, placed serious stress on the agency, she said. So much of this is self-inflicted wounds, Romage said. This account of turmoil within the Social Security Administration is based on interviews with 8 current and former employees, most of whom spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss private deliberations. The Post also reviewed more than a dozen pages of internal agency records and communications. Some elements of the latest disarray at Social Security, including the decision to end Dodgy's ineffective phone fraud check and the agency's request that its employees work harder to process the building backlog of claims, were earlier reported by NextGov and HuffPost. Social Security is fielding an unprecedented number of retirement claims, with 575,000 pending, including 430,000 that have arrived in the past 60 days. Gee whiz. According to an email sent to staff this week and reviewed by the Post. Stephen Evangelista, the agency's deputy commissioner for operations, wrote in the email that employees must work 10% harder. Okay. In a sprint through the end of May, which of course has come and gone already, to address this growing backlog, calls to the agency's processing centers are already spiking from seniors who complain that the main 1-800 hotline is going unanswered and who fear their checks will stop because of the Trump administration's changes to Social Security, employees said. Social Security is poorly positioned to handle the influx, according to several staffers, as well as records obtained by the Post. Thousands of employees have taken the Trump administration's early resignation offer or its early retirement offer, depleting the workforce and leaving some offices wholly bereft of staff, emails show. And of course, I don't know why they don't call it right out, adding to the backlog of new retirement claims all of a sudden. It has to be the case, right? A Dodgy-led move to slash staffing levels spurred many senior administrators scared of getting fired into accepting reassignment to lower-level field office positions, slowing claims processing even further as those employees are trained, according to employees and records. The tumult comes as Frank Bisignano, I'm going to pronounce it that way, Bisignano, finishes his first week as Social Security's Senate-confirmed commissioner. After getting a chance to see agency operations up front, Bisignano had grown alarmed by the drastic downsizing ordered by Dodgy and carried out by a mid-level employee, Leland Dudek, whose name we've read before, but who led the agency in an acting role, for 4 months, according to one senior official, and one former senior official briefed on Bisignano's thinking, if there is any. Oh, I don't remember Leland Dudek. He was a guy who was already working for the Social Security Administration, but like 1 or 2 levels down, who was the last guy who didn't retire or get fired and who kind of enthusiastically took up the reins in an acting capacity so that he could cooperate with the Dodgy Boys and become a superstar of some kind. And, well, now the other guy came in and took over, so too bad. That seems to be over with. Bisignano is coming to dislike Dodgy and hopes to minimize the team's influence, the officials said. Another official, however, said Bisignano wants to partner with Dodgy, so we'll see which one it is. Maybe not. It's a month since the article's been written. I don't have any sense of what that's really like. Asked about the worsening problems at Social Security, the White House spokeswoman, Liz Houston, I guess, Huston, looks like Huston, probably pronounced Houston, who knows. Anyway, guess what? She praised Dodgy's activities at the agency. Dodgy has played a critical role in improving the Social Security Administration. Sure, of course. From modernizing its technology infrastructure to enhancing efforts to identify waste, fraud, and abuse, she said in a statement, this important work will continue to ensure the federal government is properly serving the American taxpayers. Oh, I guess not. The next section, subheader, is they knew there was no fraud. Isn't that something? Dodgy staffers came to Social Security vowing to end fraudulent claims filed by scammers and grifters, and convinced that much of the activity was perpetrated over the phone, the Post has previously reported. I'm sure we read that. Career staff attempted to explain that wasn't true, but to no avail. That's to no avail usually gets a trombone thing there, I would think. Career staff attempted to explain that wasn't true, but to no avail, according to 3 current and former employees familiar with the matter. Dodgy proposed ending phone service for retirement and disability claims, then narrowed its proposal after backlash from older claims recipients, advocates, and lawmakers, and then abandoned the idea, I guess, entirely. Tacoed right the hell out of that, I guess. Staff on the IT side developed a solution they hoped would pacify Dodgy, a 3-day hold on phone calls to allow extra checking for fraud, the employees said. Everyone from rank-and-file career staff up to Dudek knew the phone fraud check was not needed, the employees said anyway, but they did it anyhow. People lacked the fortitude to tell Dodgy there was no fraud because they were afraid to lose their jobs, one former high-ranking official said, referring specifically to claims filed by telephone. They knew there was no fraud. The 3-day check went into place late last month. That would have been late April. It was modeled on a system already used to verify internet claims, one employee familiar with the matter said. When claims come in through the Social Security website, they often sit for a few days in a database before staff on the operations side are able to start working on them. Other staff elsewhere in the agency use that dead time to apply special checks for fraud, the employee said. By the time operations staff can pick up the claims, the fraud checks are completed and everything is ready to go. But applying that same system to phone calls led to trouble, employees said. Operations staff taking calls from seniors normally process the claims as they happen, finishing up while still on the phone. Instead, under the new system, staff had to take down callers' information before transferring claims to another part of the agency where they could be reviewed for signs of fraud. After waiting 3 days, staff were supposed to pick back up their unfinished claims. It never really worked. Mostly, what it accomplished was annoying field staff and delaying claims processing, employees said. We are already overwhelmed. It added a needless task to our plate, and claims were starting to get lost, said one field office employee who dealt with the system. And it turned up almost no examples of potential fraud, employees said. The agency already has reliable methods for identifying fraud on the phone, including the fact that the staff answering the calls receive special training to catch fraudsters, they said. In recent days, seeing that Musk was stepping back from government work to focus on his struggling car company, Tesla, and suspecting that Dodgy's influence might be waning, and that he would eventually be calling for Donald Trump's impeachment and saying he was a pedophile, but I guess they didn't predict that. IT staff at the agency saw an opening. They drafted a memo for Bisignano's review calling for the end of the 3-day fraud check, according to a senior official briefed on the matter. NextGov reported first on the existence of the memo, which said the system had so far only turned up 2 cases of possible fraud out of 110,000 calls that were reviewed. On Thursday, the agency sent a message to field offices declaring that effective Saturday, claims taken over the phone will no longer be subject to a 3-day hold prior to adjudication, according to a copy obtained by the Post. Even as the dodgy-led fraud check falls flat, Social Security appears to be testing another novel change to its phone service. Jennifer Burdick, a Philadelphia-based attorney representing clients seeking disability benefits, said that in the past week, a new phone line operated by an artificial intelligence system, great, has complicated her efforts to get help for her clients. In one case, she and her paralegal had to call repeatedly before they were connected with a human to discuss a client who never got their disability check last month. Many times when you say agent, it won't put you through to the hold line. It'll act like it didn't hear what you said, Burdick said. This is causing some confusion. People are getting frustrated and trying to tell it what they mean, and instead of that being effective at all, it's been spitting out weird Social Security knowledge. Oh, that's interesting. What do they mean? When a Post reporter called the phone line Friday afternoon, it took 8 attempts to get transferred to an agent. The AI bot asked the reporter several times to end the call. Please hang up. Your call is not important to us. What do you mean, end the call? And gave unrelated information about a cost of living adjustment, Medicare's Part B premium, and benefits available to people after the retirement age. Social Security said it had plans, or has said it plans to roll out the automation to all field offices by this summer, and it is already in use by more than 350 field offices in the Southeast and Northeast as of the end of April, and I guess doing no one any good. A spokesperson said the agency is constantly improving the feature, which can be affected by many factors, including background noise, quality of the connection, and clarity of speech. Our next section, claims surge, furniture breaks. Vendors go unpaid. Now that sounds Trumpy, right? This surge in claims that Social Security faces goes beyond anything the agency has ever seen. It's like you've never seen before. In his memo to field offices this week, Evangelista wrote that, quote, "This year we've received more retirement claims than in any prior year," unquote. We know that to be the case from earlier in the article. Reasons for the surge, Evangelista wrote, include baby boomers turning 65 years old, a new law signed in January that increased Social Security retirement benefits for state and local government employees, and a recent policy change granting higher benefits to surviving spouses. But a senior official at the agency noted there is another key reason: people thinking that SSA is going to collapse because of what's going on in the government, especially with dodgy-led overhauls and cuts. Another staffer who works in a processing center said older men and women are calling in at a rate they've never seen before. Always one of my favorites. Complaining that no one picks up the main 1-800 hotline. The callers often tell workers they are worried their checks will stop and ask what's going on, the employee said. Just like talking to the people in the insurance commercial. Don't become your parents. Have you been receiving your checks? Yes, but I'm concerned that I won't. Well, if you don't, call us. Well, I just wanted to let you know I was concerned, and so don't make it happen. Make sure it doesn't. Well, okay. Anyway, the Social Security spokesperson denied that the processing center has seen an unusual spike, okay, and claimed that the average time it takes to answer calls to the main hotline has decreased. That measure does not account, though, for dropped calls and busy signals. As calls flood in, staff are fleeing. Since February, Dudek has overseen the elimination of 7,000 jobs through early retirements, buyouts, resignations, and firings. He told the remaining workforce of about 50,000 last month that he hoped such cuts would be enough, but Dodgy disagreed, and the Post has previously reported, and drafted plans to slash thousands more staff. Fearing firings, employees leaped at the chance to leave under a second-round resignation offer unveiled last month, April, with 2,500 people taking the buyout, costing field offices about 10% of their staff. IT departments were especially hard hit, and some offices were wiped out completely, including the Security Division for the Office of Hearings Operations. According to an email obtained by the Post, many employees in management roles accepted reassignment to lower-level field office roles because they were warned they would lose their jobs if they didn't take the demotion, according to employees in emails obtained by the Post. Those staffers now face months of retraining as they learn to process claims. Some arriving in field offices are finding a dire situation. No more paper. No more printers, no ability to shred documents, pay phone bills, or hire foreign language interpreters, according to interviews with half a dozen staffers spread across the country. That's because Dodgy reduced federal spending cards to $1 and declared that one of less than a dozen people must sign off on purchases for all 1,300 field offices, leaving few able to replenish basic office supplies or pay for other needs. Some vendors are refusing service until they're paid for past services provided, one staffer said. Things break and there's no money to replace furniture. Frustrated employees have begun paying out of their own pockets for everything from pens to, in one northeastern office, a refrigerator. We are going to purchase a new fridge since the funds that would normally be available for facilities to provide us with one are still frozen. Read an email sent in late April and obtained by the Post. Before we do, I would like to see if anyone else is interested in contributing. Wow, they have to buy that just to, have a place to put their lunch during the day if they brown bag it. Well, things are going swimmingly there. Dodge is fixing everything. And as I said, there's later reporting, much more contemporary, falling in between. Well, I guess this is right about the same time, actually. Oh, you know what? As a matter of fact, this comes right before this piece. But I mentioned that there was new reporting that reflected a similar experience at other departments. And the other department I had in mind is the Department of Veterans Affairs. So also in May, now that I'm looking at the date here, so the Washington Post piece was May 16th. And about a week before that, on May 8th, there was this piece I knew I had seen. I was reading something that was much newer from early June. And they mentioned the founder of, I don't know what kind of website this is, Gumroad, not Silk Road, Gumroad. And I thought, I have seen that before. Where have I seen this? And I turned it up in Pocket. So back on May 8th, there was this article in Fast Company. Thanks to Dodgy, Gumroad's founder has a second job with the VA. And it sort of foreshadowed this story that I found on, I don't know, June 5th or so. I guess was that Thursday? Last Thursday? In which NPR was reporting on the Gumroad founder and his exit from Dodgy. So this piece from May 8th, thanks to Dodgy, Gumroad's founder has a second job with the VA, has a subheader, the creator economy pioneer. Sahil Lavingia is my best guess at the pronunciation. Anyway, on his eyebrow-raising decision to embrace Dodgy, and after thinking it over, open source. So, It's a little bit about his Gumroad thing, but also a lot about Dodgy. And it foreshadows a lot of what we learned at the end of the previous week about this guy's exit. And you can see it coming if you read this. Except we set it aside and didn't read it at the time. Ernie Smith wrote this piece for Fast Company. And there's an update to it that basically gets to, one, everything that seems to be foreshadowed in this piece, and two, is reported by an NPR article and edited interview with Sahil later on. So I'll skip the update, but you'll see what's coming. Sahil Lavingia, and it's Lavingia. It might be Lavinia. I'm not sure, but we got to pick one or the other. And I don't know, maybe Lavinia is closer. I suppose that, well, Lavinia, if the G and the N were reversed, it would be like that, I guess, based on lasagna. I don't know. You tell me what's going on here. Sahil Lavinia has just had 3 jobs over a 15-year career in tech, which I guess is unusual. The first was as the second employee at Pinterest. I think you might all be familiar with that one. The second of these jobs was by founding the startup Gumroad, which they describe here as a successful, famously, lean company that makes it easy for content creators to sell digital goods. I don't know what that means, but the third, as an unpaid contractor supporting the Department of Veterans Affairs in a role facilitated by the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, a fact recently revealed in a Wired piece. And maybe that was perhaps where we originally saw all of this, inside DOGE's AI push at the Department of Veterans Affairs. I think we probably did put that one aside and then just didn't get to the full story. At any rate, one of these 3 jobs is not like and is far more controversial than the others, and I'm sure you can guess which one it is. But Lavinia, who chose not to speak to Wired, even after they did their story, or maybe because they did their story, but reached out to me, Ernie, the writer for Fast Company here, after I drew attention to the piece, presumably in a earlier publication elsewhere. Oh, yeah, there it is. Tedium.co. Is that where it was published? Very interesting. Well, Lavinia makes no excuses for his decision to join DOGE's tidal wave of on-the-fly federal contractors. He says he's able to work without pay because of Gumroad's success, and that he is driven by a sense of mission. The reason I did it, I think, is the impact I can have, he explains. Lavinia says that in the private sector, technical employees can have between 6 and 7 figures of financial impact over their lifetime. If they're a successful startup founder like he is, maybe that number is larger. But in the government, I really believe that I can have billions of dollars of positive impact just by being technically minded. To hear it from Lavinia, the Elon Musk-backed DOGE was a shortcut in a direction he already saw himself going. Years ago, during the Obama administration, he applied to the United States Digital Service, the predecessor organization to DOGE, in a way, only to find the hiring process arduous. Oh no, not that. While he officially works for the VA, DOGE gave him an inroad into government work that didn't force him to go through a complicated vetting process. Let's just assume everything's going to work fine and you know what you're doing. They just sent me to the VA, he says. They just kind of helped me find the job, which is great. I'm proud of that. Reflecting his tongue-in-cheek stance that DOGE is, quote, a glorified temp agency for software engineers, unquote, he got in through the side entrance, offering his services to the cause of government efficiency. I'm basically taking Elon at his word, he admits. Well, that sounds dumb, but maybe only because I know what happens in the end. But I already knew, I think, what would happen if you took Elon at his word. Wait, doesn't he run a company? That's the next section here. Lavinia's decision to moonlight not exactly unheard of in dodgy circles, doesn't necessarily tie to his primary gig, but he suggests that it might have inspired his recent decision to open source Gumroad. After all, it matches what he's proposing with Dodgy. I think we should open source all the code that we write, he says of his VA work. And I think that if we did that, I'm not saying people will agree with us, but at least people will see what we're doing. His VA side hustle comes at a time when Gumroad itself is going through some major structural changes. Last year, the company rebranded its corporate structure as antiwork.com. Well, I'm not certain what that's supposed to mean. Inspired directly by a popular Reddit community of the same name, as part of its restructuring, it began putting its various apps on GitHub, including Gumroad. The announcement taking Gumroad open source had some odd timing, it says parenthetically here, hitting on the same day as the Wired story. Lavinia claims it was unintentional and unfortunate. In one sense, this was a positive move for tech fans who run web apps and other software on their own infrastructure. Now they have a new tool at their disposal, and Gumroad has pledged to make it easier for them to install and maintain its code in the coming months. 2 weeks, we'll say. But the launch raised questions in part because the license wasn't purely open source. With limits on the upside for commercial enterprises, tech users were skeptical. In response to the feedback, almost on a whim, parenthetically it says, I just kind of woke up one day and I was like, F it, but he says the whole thing. Let's just do this thing. What a great guy. He just move fast, break things. Lavinia decided to move the Gumroad code base to the MIT license, which is undoubtedly a term of art that those of you in the business understand readily and the rest of us don't. That license, which companies such as Netflix and Apple have used to support their empire building, essentially allows users to do what they want with code without any requirements or limitations on its commercial use. Unlike the equally well-known general public license, it does not require the creation of open-source derivative works. There are technical reasons for the licensing decision that go beyond helping a few self-hosters. Gumroad is a prominent example of a complex code base built on the Ruby on Rails framework, something Lavinia claims there are only limited examples of in the commons. From an AI standpoint, he says, this creates a knock-on effect where providers of large language models are less helpful with Rails than with competing frameworks like React. Okay, sure, I'll take your word for it. Internally, Anti-Work aims for Gumroad to get 100,000 stars on GitHub. No idea what that sentence means. A number Lavinia freely admits is arbitrary, but don't be arbitrary and capricious. But what matters is it's a good proxy, he says. Did we actually build something people use, fork, like I guess split off from, and get value from? It's currently at 5,700 stars. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Well, if you're trying to get to 100,000, sounds like a little. I don't know. Lavinia says the timing of his work at the VA is coincidental, but it helped inspire his thinking about open sourcing. Simply put, in a climate where equipment is often purchased through a complex bidding process, federal agencies have more flexibility with open source tooling. He uses the example of Drupal, an open source content management system that is ubiquitous throughout the government and enterprise, but has a reputation among tech enthusiasts as being an older framework. People probably in startups would not say Drupal is their first choice, but what is really good about Drupal is that it's open source, he says. It has a lot of packages and extensions, and it's probably no coincidence that the government runs on Drupal for a lot of its CMS needs instead of some commercial proprietary thing. One could see an automation-minded coding whiz like Lavinia modernizing the VA's stack around more efficient tools, but as the security card mechanisms in many government-procured laptops highlight, federal agencies are a different beast. Golly, I hope some of you know what this means. A startup lifer's view of the VA comes next. Much of what has been written about dodgy, the push to get employees into sensitive systems, I'm up to speed on this stuff, the aggressive attempts at layoffs, the weekly emails, has not endeared the work to the public, and Musk recently took a step back from the endeavor and then took a step off a cliff, as you know. What people have heard about dodgy, they don't like. A recent New York Times poll analysis found survey respondents favored the idea of improving government efficiency and even the idea of dodgy, but not the way it was being done, which is pretty much the story with all Trump administration endeavors, up to and including immigration enforcement, of course. But hearing a first-person perspective of what's happening on the ground from Lavinia is nonetheless revealing. He's someone who has gone from being the big fish in a tiny pond to just another person in an agency that counts more than 400,000 employees on its payroll. Though, as with elsewhere in the federal government, it is also seeing cuts. Now that he's there, he says he finds himself surrounded by people who love their jobs, who came to the government with a sense of mission driving their work. Not unlike him. Isn't that something? In a sense, that makes the dodgy agenda a little bit more complicated, because if half the government took a buyout offer, then we wouldn't have to do much more, he says, implying software can replace departing employees. We'd just basically use software to plug holes, but that's not what's happening. Lavinia's skills with automation, which have helped keep Gumroad lean, are what he hopes to bring to the VA. But when it comes down to it, what he's found is a machine that largely functions, though it doesn't make decisions as fast as a startup might. I would say the culture shock is mostly a lot of meetings, not a lot of decisions, he says. But honestly, it's kind of fine because the government works. It's not as inefficient as I was expecting, to be honest. I was hoping for more easy wins. In contrast to dodgy's shadowy reputation, Lavinia has made the case for transparency. Based on a pledge he received from Musk during a meeting, Lavinia has been open sourcing his VA work, creating tools that can generate org charts and detect compliance with the president's executive orders. If you aren't a fan of dodgy's work, the open source code, while useful for transparency, probably won't make you feel any better about Lavinia's work at the VA. The compliance code, for example, is effectively a Python script that hooks into OpenAI servers hosted on Microsoft Azure, detecting whether a federal agency's communication references chief diversity officers, pronouns, or WHO, the World Health Organization, partnerships, although probably just detects every use of the word who as well. However, Lavinia makes it clear that dodgy has limits, especially thanks to the court decisions and palace intrigue that have removed much of its bite. Ultimately, he argues it has become a way for roving engineers to get an up-close view of how government works. A McKinsey for the government, as he puts it. I think dodgy both gets too much credit and too much blame. He says, blame the people who actually have the authority to make the decisions. It's like when people say billionaires are evil. I'm like, well, maybe, but really the people at fault would be the lawmakers, right? I don't know. And it does sound like he doesn't know. Lavinia strikes me as someone who genuinely cares about the work he's doing, but who thinks about it like a software engineer. There may be a case for startup lifers to swoop in and out of government, sharing the latest technological innovations with a complex beast in dire need of more efficiency, but the move fast and break things style may simply be too swift and damaging when essential government services are on the line. Yes. Next up, a fork in the gum road. No matter how Lavinia sees things from a day-to-day perspective, the truth is that people who feel betrayed by Gumroad's association with dodgy have a new reason to go with another creator-friendly tool. So that creates problems for him at his daytime gig, I guess you might call it. But it's not the first knock against the service. Its traditional laissez-faire approach to content moderation, oh no. Controversially, the site is the digital storefront of one-time Adult Swim sketch comic Sam Hyde. That doesn't sound particularly problematic. Notorious for his alt-right ties. That does. Has long raised eyebrows. The company's heavy use of automation has also created problems for users concerned about customer support. Evan Hildreth, a writer and programmer, recently expressed frustration with the platform's changes and his inability to reach a support person that wasn't an LLM. Even with the licensing changes, he felt like he could no longer trust the platform. These changes to email and memberships really shook my confidence in the product itself, he said. Lavinia said Gumroad is working to hire additional customer support staff. Oh, too bad. And more recently, the platform has started to limit not safe for work content, with Lavinia suggesting to TechCrunch last year that an unnamed supplier required the stricter approach. But even considering all that, Lavinia seemingly hadn't taken into account one key aspect of open sourcing that the MIT license could allow, the potential of folks turned off by his moonlighting gig creating their own version of Gumroad by forking the code and continuing development independently. When I posed the question, he isn't entirely opposed. He admits that the brutal form of capitalism the MIT license allows for might force Gumroad to compete a little harder, or perhaps become more community-oriented like WordPress. I kind of want that, almost. I want to move on with my life, he says. If someone launches blueroad.com or something worse on the right, whatever. While Gumroad, a small company with outsized impact on the creator economy, isn't going away, going open source nonetheless seems like something Lavinia has been preparing to do for a while. Gumroad is now 14 years old, so maybe the analogy is, my kid's going off to college and it's not my problem anymore, he says, and maybe this means Gumroad will get even weirder in the future, right? Given the current context, it's already off to a weird start. Okay, well, that whole thing went a little bit weird, but that's because it was much more tech biz oriented than we usually read, being that it was from, where the hell was it from again? I can't even remember anymore. Fastcompany.com. So it was definitely going to be like that. And probably the Wired magazine piece a little bit like that too. Maybe we should check into that. But now to bring you more up to date, a June 5th entry from NPR, which I guess includes an interview with Lavinia here, whose name, the more I say it, the more I'm thinking maybe it is Lavingia after instead. But anyway, I really couldn't tell you. I have no idea what the guy's background is and whose surname that is. But former dodgy engineer, there's the answer for you. Former dodgy engineer says federal waste and fraud were, quote, relatively non-existent. So now he's kind of come to the conclusion. First, I thought there would be more easy stuff to find, and then I realized it was actually working pretty well, and now I realize it actually didn't need us, and we might have actually hurt things by sticking our noses where they didn't belong. This was an NPR piece put together for All Things Considered by Lauren Hodges, Patrick, oh dear, why did I start down this road? Jaron Watananon, oh my gosh, I hope I didn't ruin that, and Wanna Summers, not Donna Summers, she was very cool, but this is Wanna Summers, who I'm doubtless also pretty cool. Anyway, their story goes like this. A former employee of the department, which is in the Department of Government Efficiency, says that he found that the federal waste, fraud, and abuse that his agency was supposed to uncover were, quote, relatively non-existent during his short time embedded with the Department of Government Affairs. I personally was pretty surprised, actually, at how efficient the government was. Sahil Lavingia, we'll say it in this way, and that way maybe we'll cover our bases, told NPR's Juana Summers. Lavingia was a successful software developer and the founder of, everyone can say it with us now, Gumroad, yay, a platform for online sales, When he joined Dodgy in March, Lavingia said he had previously sought to work for the U.S. Digital Service. We heard that. The technology unit that was renamed and restructured by the Trump administration. He told NPR that he just wanted to make government websites easier for citizens to use and didn't really care which presidential administration he was working for, despite protests from his friends and family. Lavingia said the overall message at Dodgy was transparency and a vibe of ask for forgiveness, not permission. So, when a blogger asked for an interview about Gumroad, he agreed. And when asked, he talked about his work at Dodgy, including how little inefficiency he saw compared to what he was expecting. Elon was pretty clear, this is the quote, about how he wanted Dodgy to be maximally transparent, Lavingia said. That's something he said a lot in private and publicly. And so I thought, okay, cool, I'll take him at his word. I will be transparent. Shortly after the interview was published online, Lavingia got an email. Just 55 days into his work at Dodgy, his access had been revoked. The leopard ate his face. And now, the interview, which follows, we are told, has been edited for length and clarity. And here it is. The interview highlights go like this. Rather than doing it dialogue style, they pull out the best bits this way. On why he wanted to work there. Why did you want to work there, Sahil? It's hard for me to think of a better way to have a larger impact as someone who writes code every day and enjoys, designing and building products, web applications, iPhone applications, than working for the U.S. federal government. And Bernie, Hillary, Obama, Trump, it doesn't really matter to me if the work is making it easier to pay taxes or, making it easier for veterans to collect benefits. I like when my software gets used by a lot of people and people send me nice emails. In this case, people weren't sending me the nicest emails, unfortunately, but they also didn't really know what I was doing. They saw Dodgy, weren't a fan of certain things that they were associated with, but I think at the end of the day, like the role of the U.S. Digital Service is to improve the UX or user experience of being an American, which is pretty exciting. And anyone who lets me do that, I will try to work for, even if my friends and family aren't huge fans. I can almost sympathize with the guy, but I caution you, don't worry yourself with that. On the lack of fraud and spending abuse that he saw, he says, I did not find the federal government to be rife with waste, fraud, and abuse. I was expecting, we heard this before, some more easy wins. I was hoping for opportunity to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and I do believe that there is a lot of waste. There's minimal amounts of fraud, and abuse, to me, feels relatively non-existent. And the reason is, I think we have a bias as people coming from the tech industry where we worked at companies, like Google, Facebook. These companies that have plenty of money are funded by investors and have lots of people kind of sitting around doing nothing. Isn't that something that's really amazing? He comes to the total opposite conclusion. How many people have told us that only private businesses and competitive businesses like that are really lean and really know how to cut out the waste, fraud, and abuse, and it's the government where the employees are sitting around doing nothing. But actually, if you sit down and think about it, you probably have come to the same conclusion on your own at some point. Like, there's no foosball tables and free bagels and espresso and whatnot machines in government offices, right? The culture of sit around and enjoy the perks and maybe hide in a job where no one finds out that you can't do anything is probably a lot greater there than it is in the government. Just because of the red tape you have to go through to get hired and stay hired in the government, which is, do they even check on employees with performance reviews in some of these fast-growing companies? Anyway, back to the interview material. The government, he tells people, has been under a sort of magnifying glass for decades, and so I think generally I personally was pretty surprised, actually, at how efficient the government was. This isn't to say that it can't be made more efficient, elimination of paper, elimination of faxing, but these aren't necessarily fraud, waste, and abuse. These are just rooms to modernize and improve the U.S. federal government into the 21st century. Okay, interesting. On what happened before he was let go. Ready for this one? I probably stupidly was asked by not even a journalist, but a writer who just has a blog about my business going open source, Gumroad, and I spoke to him. He had a bunch of questions about me working for Dodgy, and I felt that Elon was pretty clear about how he wanted Dodgy to be maximally transparent. Uh-oh. Did he really want that? No, of course not. Wow. But he went in for it. Okay. That's something he said a lot in private and publicly. And so I felt, okay, cool. I'll take him at his word. Remember that? I will be transparent and sort of ask forgiveness, not permission sort of thing. I said mostly that the government was not as inefficient as I was expecting. And then my access got revoked pretty shortly after. I didn't get notified. I was basically ghosted, and I just got an email notification that my access was no longer valid. Unfortunately, they did not tell me directly that the reason I was let go was because of my transparency. I don't know if irony is the right word, and the leopard eating a face is the right analogy, though. But I do think that it's maybe, as Elon says, the most entertaining outcome is the most likely, and letting someone go for being transparent in the most maximally transparent organization is a little bit entertaining. Well, I'm glad he's got a lighthearted view of it, and he wasn't getting paid anyway, so he goes back to Gumroad. But guess what? They're eating those faces left and right, those leopards, and now, of course, they've finally gotten around to eating Elon's. Now, before we get too excited about Sahil Lavinia, and I, by the way, I went to YouTube to look for interviews with him to see how he pronounced his name, and he never pronounces it. He never tells anybody. I don't know. No, none of the footage that I saw does he ever say, my name is Sahil Lavinia or Lavignia or Vingia or anything of the sort. But I have seen other people introduce him. Unfortunately, I have now seen people introduce him as both, and he makes no objection to either one, which maybe is just preparation for talking to Donald Trump. He said he could call him either one and just leave it at that. I did notice that the people who were interviewing him, who appeared to be Indian or South Asian, said Lavinia, and the Anglo-appearing people actually said Lavingia. So I don't know. I'm not really certain how he prefers it, and I guess it's too late to bother caring at this point. But here, before we get too excited about, oh, well, maybe he's a good guy because he's fessing up to the fact that there wasn't really much waste, fraud, or abuse going on. Yes, and I think it's probably good that he would own up to it, and we'll take it for what it's worth. But I want to give you this other piece. This takes you back again. We're jumping back and forth in time to April 4th, so very early on in April 2025, when he's still in the middle of his work for Doji at VA, and the people at the VA are reacting to what it's like to have him arrive on the scene. So I thought this one was interesting. I skimmed it just to make sure, like, okay, what does this add to the picture? I don't know, but I'm trying to fill time. But this gives us a more complete picture, I think, of what was going on, and some interesting points about why you can't just, why don't you justism doesn't work any better for tech than it does for anything else. Inside Dodgy's AI push at the Department of Veterans Affairs, a Dodgy operative at the Department of Veterans Affairs appears to be trying to use an AI tool to write code for the agency's systems, among other proposals, which is interesting in itself because you've been recruited by Dodgy and have been given the keys to a gigantic agency that affects, 1 million plus people's lives because you're a genius coder and you can do this stuff. But instead you're like, well, why don't I have AI write the code? Well, why don't you write the code like we asked you to do? Well, because I'm not getting paid. Well, you didn't ask to be paid. Do the job as a human. Do it right. Don't screw around. Anyway, we'll see what happens here. Victoria Elliott wrote this for Wired. And again, this is jumping back in time to early April. Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which we know affectionately here as Dodgy, except it's not affectionate, has been clear about its plans to fire tens of thousands of employees at the Department of Veterans Affairs. New Wired reporting sheds light on the specific Dodgy operatives at the VA and the ways they're trying to infiltrate and drastically change the agency. On March 25th, tech staffers and contractors at the VA noticed an unfamiliar name trying to push changes that could impact va.gov code. It was Sahil Lavinia, a newcomer to the agency. We'll go back to Lavinia for now. Newcomer to the agency, listed in the VA's internal directory as an advisor to the Chief of Staff, Christopher Syrek, Syrek. Lavinia's presence, on behalf of the president, I guess, Lavinia's presence in the VA's GitHub instance, oh boy, we're in Wired magazine after all, a publicly viewable platform that houses projects and code for va.gov, set off immediate alarm bells. It bore all the hallmarks of Dodgy's incursion into the federal government. Lavinia, a startup CEO and engineer with no government experience, all of a sudden had power and was in their systems. Since then, VA employees say they have had multiple concerns following interactions with Lavinia. Beyond his GitHub access, sources who spoke to Wired indicate that Lavinia, who said on Slack that he wanted to digitize the agency, also appears to be trying to use an AI tool called Open Hands to write code for the VA's systems. One person with knowledge says that Lavinia had been given what's known as a zero account, which would allow him to be granted privileged access to VA systems. In response to Wired's questions about his work at the VA, Lavinia responded by email saying, "Sorry, I'm not going to answer these, besides to say I'm unpaid and a fan of your work." Now remember, this is at the height of Wired's really great hot streak on reporting on what was going on in Dodgy circles, and it's still going on, of course, and he may very well be a genuine fan of their work, given how much to heart he took the transparency message, so much so that it got him fired and his face eaten by the leopards. Lavinia is not the only Dodgy representative at the VA. According to sources within the agency, the Dodgy delegation also includes Carrie Volpert, probably known as Voldemort in those circles, and Christopher Roussos. Other known Dodgy members, one other, at the VA includes, they're known Dodgy members after all, yes, include Justin Fulker, who I feel like we read his name recently for some reason, who ran a telehealth startup that went bankrupt in the late 2010s. That's pretty good. And Peyton Reeling, Rehling, and John Koval, Koval, both of whom worked for Valor Equity Partners, and appeared at the Social Security Administration along with the fund's founder and Musk ally, Antonio Gracias. These Dodgy operatives appear to have no work experience that's remotely close to the VA in terms of its scale or complexity. The VA administers all the government benefits afforded to veterans and their families for roughly 10 million people. I think I said 10 million people, including education, loans, disability payments, and health care. Lavinia is the CEO of Gumroad, of course, a platform that, let's see what this description is, a platform that helps creatives sell their work and takes a cut of each sale. Normal enough, taking a cut, but okay. Tells me nothing. More recently, according to his blog, Lavinia launched Flexile, a tool to manage and pay contractors. It's called invoicing, I believe. According to his LinkedIn profile, Lavinia was the second employee at Pinterest, which he left in 2011 to found Gumroad. Lavinia is also an angel investor in other startups via SHL Capital. What do you think SHL is about? Which backed Clubhouse and Lambda School, among others. Means absolutely nothing to me. Volpert, who is listed as a senior advisor to the chief of staff, like him, right, is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. On a third-party job site, Volpert is listed as the founder of a startup called Lindy Live, which once offered social engagement for senior citizens. Okay, I think that's called Shuffleboard. But whatever. According to documents viewed by Wired, Volpert has been reviewing VA contracts with what appears to be the intent of canceling those agreements. Russos is the former CEO of 24-Hour Fitness. That's a real thing. I've seen that. And most recently was CEO of Allerv Health, an allergy and immunology startup, or starting new allergies for people. According to his LinkedIn profile, last February, he became chair of the company's board of directors and rolled out 10 new vegetable allergies, perhaps. He's also listed as an advisor to the chief of staff at the VA. He's got a lot of advisors, this chief of staff. Volpert, Russos, and Lavinia, according to a source at the VA, were introduced by agency leadership in meetings as dodgy representatives. Dodgy's actions at the VA are putting veterans' lives at risk. Representative Gerald Connolly, whose own life was, of course, at risk at the time, he just didn't know how much longer he had. But this was back in April, when he was alive and ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, and told Wired magazine, veterans, he added, risk being stripped of the care they need and deserve because Trump and Elon have turned the VA over to lackeys who do not know the first thing about what it means to serve your country. VA employees have expressed concerns about the changes that dodgy staffers have already started to make to the agency. These people have zero clue what they are working on, a VA employee tells Wired. The VA did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Neither did Volpert, Russos, Fulker, Railing, or Koval. Lavinia's work, however, appears to have informed his present outlook at the VA, especially when it comes to AI. In a blog post on his personal website from October 2024, Lavinia discussed how Gumroad, which laid off most of its employees in 2015, had achieved financial stability, replacing every manual process with an automated one by pushing all marginal costs to the customer and having almost no employees. Today, humans are necessary for stellar customer service, crisis management, regulatory compliance and negotiations, property inspections, and more, he wrote, but it won't be long until AI can do all of the above. So he's a true believer, I guess. Two sources familiar with Lavinia's work at the VA note that he appears to be trying to introduce an AI tool called Open Hands to write code for the agency. In GitHub, Lavinia requested to add Open Hands to the repertoire of programs that can be used by VA tech workers and noted in Slack that this was, quote, a priority for the chief of staff and secretary, unquote. Open Hands, it notes parenthetically, is available for anyone to download on GitHub. They've asked us to consider using AI for all development contracts and have us justify why it can't do it, says the VA employee. I think they're considering how to fill the gaps of canceled contracts, that is, with AI. We don't really have approval to use AI because there is sensitive info on some of the GitHub repos. I don't know what that really means, GitHub repos, but you tell me. Says a second VA tech worker who, like other sources, asked to remain anonymous because they're not authorized to talk to the media. Theoretically, it could script something and pull out a bunch of data. Much of that data, according to the source, is stored and accessed through several application programming interfaces. This includes information like the social security numbers of veterans and their family members and bank information, as well as medical and disability history. New tools also mean new security risks. Any programming tools or applications that you use in federal systems have to meet a bunch of security classifications, the source says. They worry that the proposed use of Open Hands has not been properly vetted for government purposes for security gaps that could possibly leave the VA's systems and data vulnerable. That's why you don't just, in this why don't you justism kind of world. They're not following any of the normal procedures, and it's putting people at risk, they say, noting that a system failure could impede veterans' ability to access their benefits. These are people who have given pieces of themselves, in some cases literally, I would say, to their country, and they deserve more respect than that. A former VA employee who worked in the office of the CTO and asked for anonymity in order to protect their privacy says that Open Hands was not, as far as they knew, a tool approved for use at the agency. When asked to evaluate it based on the security assessment used at the agency, the person says that the tool's ability to modify code, run commands, browse the web, call APIs, according to its website, was particularly concerning. That alarms me. That gives me Skynet vibes, they say. I don't necessarily want a computer to have all those capabilities unsupervised. Open Hands did not immediately reply to a request for comment. The source also says that AI-generated code can pose significant risks in general. I would not want a tool like this writing code on va.gov because I think it would lead to a higher likelihood of bugs and therefore security issues being introduced into the platform, they say, adding that buggy code could be easier to hack, introducing more security vulnerabilities. It could also accidentally access or modify the wrong data, including sensitive data. And even if the AI-generated code works well, it can be unmaintainable because it is so complicated that even the people generating the code may not fully understand it and therefore not be able to update or change it when needed. Lavinia has quickly suggested other changes at the VA as well. Why not? Let's do it all. Sources say Lavinia asked if there was a way to use veterans' social security numbers or other identifying information to pre-fill customer forms with data from the VA system without the user being logged in. I don't know. And I understand maybe the drive for something like this. I know how many times have you filled out a form either in person or online for a doctor's office, even in the same visit, and say, I just filled the same information out a page ago. Why can't you take this? And the answer is, if you let the computer store it and access it without your permission or without you putting it in so that we're sure it's you doing it, well, that makes it compromised. It's possible to steal that information now. So, although it would be cool if you only had to fill out one form and it would populate all the rest of them, the reality of data security says, yeah, I don't think so. That's not really going to actually, keep things safe. This kind of pre-filling requires users to be authenticated within VA's systems, which not all of them are. A VA employee pushed back, noting that there are fraud and risk concerns about someone submitting a form on behalf of a veteran when they have not been established as their caretaker, even if it's AI doing it, right? Another employee noted this change would make it easier to submit fraudulent forms at scale. I mean, come on, right? Can you imagine the dodgy boys come in and actually make massive fraud possible where it used to not be and say, well, I thought that was what we were supposed to do. And it may yet end up being what they've done, of course. In a March 26th Slack message, Lavinia also suggested that the agency should do away with paper forms entirely, aiming for full digitization, which is great if you're a tech CEO or a 20-something, but not if you are, an 80-year-old amputee veteran. Many vets don't have computers or can't see at all, they say. My skin is crawling thinking about the nonchalantness of this guy. Well, that's a different view. Lavinia's earliest activity on the VA's GitHub is indicative of the broader tensions at the agency. According to GitHub pull requests and people familiar with his work, Lavinia sought to change the text in the website's footer, where the agency lists its social media presence, from Twitter to, of course, to X, Musk having renamed Twitter to X after purchasing it in 2022. That change was not as simple as it sounds, and that I'm sure baffled them, right? We wanted it to say X, parentheses, formerly Twitter, or something similar, says the second VA tech worker. Why? This was because the letter X on its own is not big enough to be compliant with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. Now, that's a fancy way of expressing this problem and making it sound like it's government bureaucracy that's stupid. But it requires federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. Why is that a problem? A single letter would be too difficult for someone to actually tap or click on, right? A disabled, maybe elderly, barely computer literate person seeing one single character, one single letter in possibly a different color or underline, not very likely to recognize it as the link that it is. And if that's what they needed to follow, they're never going to find it, right? X.com. The single letter would be too difficult. And other VA workers suggested maybe they use X.com. Now, again, in an attempt to make the text more readable and accessible to disabled users. But guess what? Now, X.com is not an acceptable replacement. It must be X, consistent with the other sites where we use the names they prefer, Lavinia responded. The VA website now simply lists X. Now, I don't know how many people really need to access the VA's X account or X feed. That's not going to do anything, but the regulation says all the things on there and all the links got to be legible and accessible for everybody. They're just saying that's what is required by law. You guys don't care about that because in Silicon Valley, you don't have that requirement. We do. All we have to do is say X, formerly Twitter. And, also a bunch of people who actually maybe just got used to the idea of there being a Twitter have no idea it's called X now and would probably say that's a stupid name. Doesn't make any sense. X. Twitter didn't either, but X makes less. In a GitHub ticket viewed by Wired, Lavinia also suggested abandoning Drupal, a content management system, or CMS, thank you, that the VA uses for publishing updates and information about the agency and the services it provides on VA facility websites. I think we should consider removing Drupal as part of our workflow, and all content should just live in the code base, he wrote. Probably makes sense to some people. Sources say that the regular office administrators and health workers staffed at VA locations around the country are often the ones responsible for making sure that the content about their facilities are clear and up to date on their VA web pages. Instead of being able to log in to the CMS and update the appropriate text or pages, Lavinia's suggestion would mean they'd need to go into the actual code of the website to make simple changes. Any mistakes could break the sites, and one source worried that such a technical task would be too big of an ask for non-technical VA staffers. There are over 1,000 VA editors that work in the hospitals as administrators and other roles that update the websites for each VA medical center and hospital every day. They are not engineers. They can barely use a CMS at all, says the second VA worker who was shocked by Lavinia's suggestion. This guy is suggesting we move all 55,000 plus pages of live content into the code. A week after Lavinia made this suggestion, the VA did not renew a contract for the workers who managed its CMS. This means, sources claim, that the VA's facility locator, which lets users find a hospital or VA office near them, probably the most used portion of their website, may stop functioning. I don't know if it ever did, but that was the worry back in April. This feature was managed through the contractor. The dodgy account on X posted proudly, VA was previously paying around $380,000 a month for minor website modifications. That contract has not been renewed, and the same work is now being executed by one internal VA software engineer spending around 10 hours a week. VA workers, by the way, say they have no idea who that post could be referring to. Sources say that Lavinia's casual approach extends even to such issues as meeting protocols. How bad is that? Let's see. On Tuesday, and this is back in April, during a Microsoft Teams call with Chris Johnston, the agency's deputy chief technology officer, VA tech workers were surprised when they saw that someone had started recording in the middle of a call. It created a stir, says a third VA worker who was in on the meeting. In a chat box, Lavinia wrote, "Why can't we record? I think we should, unless there's a legal reason not to." At least he recognized there might be one. Noting that it would be helpful for people who couldn't attend. Another person wrote back, informing Lavinia that the deck for the meeting would be shared in the Slack channel for reference. "I think it's a good policy to assume all meetings will be recorded," Lavinia responded. You might. The source who was on the call says that recording all calls is not the norm at the agency and that it is standard practice to ask to record calls before doing so. But he says, "I see more naivete than evil," says the VA worker who was at the meeting. "If you come up in Silicon Valley, you really do start, though, to believe that because you launched some startup and were successful, you have some kind of secret sauce. And everything outside of your founder/startup ecosystem needs to be disrupted." But the worker says that Lavinia's backing by Musk and Dodgy has created a culture of fear. Everyone is scared to death of him and takes every question or suggestion as an edict, they say. Now, by the way, I do suggest at this point you should go over to YouTube and look up Sahil Lavinia and watch some interviews with him. He's not a very scary guy. He seems like a very friendly enough and reasonable enough guy. And he may very well be, but, you know, these poor guys were all working in a climate of fear. Everybody left and right is getting fired over nothing. And then Lavinia did. According to his GitHub account, it appears that while he's at the VA, one more little bit about him, Lavinia is continuing to work on his tool Flexile, which now also bears the name Anti-Work. Remember that one? GitHub records show he has been working on the code even up to this week. Back in April, the VA did not respond to questions about whether this is permissible while working with the agency. Government workers are allowed to take on some kinds of outside work, generally with agency permission, so long as it doesn't conflict with their existing role. And I'm sure, though, this is the end of the article, but I'm sure that he would say, well, I'm not getting paid for my existing role, so maybe it should be okay, or is somehow different, or maybe I'm not really an employee. I don't know, but it's definitely weird and different and raises lots of questions. All right. I just thought that really did add some interesting observations, particularly about like the little battle over whether or not to change the reference to Twitter to simply X. I'm sure it won't really disrupt a lot of veterans trying to find any usable information. You know, if they know about X or Twitter at all, they can go there and just search the VA's presence and probably find it. But, you know, that's the point. This is one of those great things where, like, look, there's a regulation and it's there for a reason. And you think it seems dumb, but think about the reason and just try to find a compromise. Why not X, parentheses, formerly Twitter? Do you really need to satisfy Elon Musk's aesthetic about that? Oh, I just want it to be X. Well, it just isn't, okay? You call it X. Everybody knows it's X, formerly Twitter. That's true. It's going to help people find it. That, you know, why would you fight about anything that would help drive content or drive users to your system, as opposed to just not understanding that it exists at all? I don't know. At any rate, I thought that was very interesting. And now we know much, much, much more than we ever wanted to know about Sahil Lavinia. But because he's likely to be in the news at this point because of the leopard having eaten his face, I thought it might be cool to add all that information to your database about him, so that you can something your GitHub until I don't even know what that means. All right, I think we're done with Sahil. Until next time. Now might be a good opportunity to share something with you that longtime listener and online pal Lamb's End Beds had sent to me via Blue Sky. Let's see, a couple weeks ago, maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, end of May. and just haven't been able to shoehorn it in, and now gives us the opportunity, along with the comment that this is a story that needs more attention. The fetal personhood movement is a danger to us all, something that's certainly been on the radar for us, but let me update you on what's happening now that should have us concerned about this. Let's see, I gotta back at this. I went in and said, oh yeah, let me at least call up the post that went along with this so that I can credit the story lead correctly. There we are. Forget Dobbs. Well, should you? No, don't forget it. But of course, it needs to be read in this context. Forget Dobbs. The personhood movement wants much more. This is published on May 30th in Mother Jones. Nina Martin is the writer here. And let's see, can I get the original, or do I need to read the pocket version? Let's start here with the original. Forget Dobbs, right? The personhood movement wants much more. What happens next with fetal personhood largely depends on what kind of democracy we have. Because that's very much in question at this point. To hear people in the anti-abortion movement tell it, the idea that human life and personhood begins at fertilization is as old as the Bible. But as abortion historian Mary Ziegler writes in her latest book, Personhood, the New Civil War Over Reproduction, the legal movement for fetal personhood only dates from the 1960s, when anti-abortion activists were losing state battles to reform abortion laws and needed a legal theory to justify strict bans. So they turned to the Constitution and found a strategy contained in the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They seem to love taking apart the 14th Amendment in weird ways. Fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses are persons, they argued, and thus should have the same legal rights and protections as anyone else. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected this radical notion 50 years ago in Roe v. Wade, and in the process established the constitutional right to abortion. But when the court reversed Roe in 2022 in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, the personhood issue was suddenly back on the table, and abortion opponents were thrilled. They see personhood as the surest path to a total national abortion ban, one that could circumvent lawmakers, ballot initiatives, and state constitutions. And we all get why that is, right? Why the connection. Maybe it's not as clear if you don't have in mind the actual text of the 14th Amendment, but it doesn't take but a second to remind us that the very first words of the 14th Amendment are that all persons born, interestingly enough, or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, and then all of the varying protections that come along with it, and privileges afforded to people then enumerated. Of course, the focus was supposed to be on naturalizing people of otherwise dubious, provenance, the people who had been held as slaves and now needed to be sort of naturalized into the citizenry. So they latch onto this. Well, all persons get this. And just another interesting, weird reading of the Constitution, right? Little bits and pieces sometimes that are inconvenient read out of the wording so that you can get your interpretation. All persons. Well, okay, why don't we define fetuses, embryos, etc. as persons, and then personhood, would lead to these various rights. Although they do skip that next, that's only three words in. All persons born or naturalized, then you can't be naturalized. I don't think you can naturalize an embryo. I doubt it very much. And they'd probably object to that now that they have the MAGA troops are on board with denying citizenship, for birthright citizenship. But all persons born, well, that would seem to preclude things for you. But I don't know. They just left that out. Anyway, let's see. We left off saying that these folks saw personhood as the surest path to a total national abortion ban that could circumvent lawmakers, ballot initiatives, and state constitutions. overturning Roe wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Kristen Hawkins, president of the increasingly influential Students for Life, wrote on the platform X when Ziegler was on MSNBC earlier this month. The fight was never just about state laws, it was about recognizing the human rights of every preborn child. Personhood is the goal, always has been. But even as personhood supporters strategize about how to get the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority to take up the issue, at the state level, fetal personhood has already become deeply entrenched in politics and law. Take Georgia, for example, where, over her family's objections, a brain-dead woman named Adriana Smith has been on life support for 3 months and counting because she is pregnant. Not only does the state's Life Act, that's a acronym, L-I-F-E, I'm not certain what it stands for, but I'm sure it was lame when they did it. The Life Act, passed in 2019, but blocked until Dobbs, now confers personhood on any embryo or fetus starting around 6 weeks. But residents can claim fetuses as dependents for tax purposes. I always wondered whether they were going to reconcile that. State officials must include fetuses in population counts, and pregnant people can demand child support before giving birth. Okay? Like Georgia, more than half of states have laws invalidating advance directives for end-of-life care if the patient is pregnant. A new lawsuit is challenging one such law in Kansas. It notes here, parenthetically, 17 states have established fetal rights by law or judicial decision, Pregnancy Justice reports, and more than 2/3 have feticide laws that make it a form of homicide to cause a pregnancy loss, such as a miscarriage or stillbirth. The most frequent targets of personhood laws are women who use drugs during pregnancy, but since Dobbs, prosecutions of women for miscarriages and stillbirths have also surged. In 2025 alone, at least 10 states have introduced new fetal personhood laws. Yet, when Americans understand the full implications of fetal personhood, they overwhelmingly oppose it. Consider the backlash that followed last year's declaration by the Alabama Supreme Court that IVF embryos are extrauterine children, a ruling that threw the fertility industry into chaos. Even Donald Trump criticized it, vowing to protect IVF and calling himself the fertility president. Ziegler, a law professor at the University of California at Davis and author of 6 other books about abortion, sees this widespread opposition as a hopeful sign for reproductive and women's rights. It's really hard for me to imagine our politics changing to a point where Americans will be okay with a version of fetal personhood that leads to IVF being effectively eliminated, she says, or women routinely being thrown into jail for having abortions. But personhood opponents will have to fight hard, Ziegler says, not just for abortion, but for democracy. And she urges them to take an important lesson from the very moment they are fighting. This is a long game. I, the author here, spoke with Ziegler from her home in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our conversation has been edited for length and clarity, and it goes something like this. I'll be playing both parts, of course, but I won't be changing my voice for the question posed here first. It's always difficult to do these Q&A things, in radio format, but you get the idea. The first question, reading your new book, maybe the most surprising thing to me is how closely the idea of personhood is entangled with the ideas about equality and discrimination. And an answer, that's one of the reasons I think personhood resonates with a lot of conservatives, because it's not just a claim about when life begins or when rights begin or how you enforce rights. It's also about who's a victim of discrimination in America. What does discrimination look like? What does equality look like? And they seem very interested in changing the definitions there to make themselves victims, generally speaking. Next question, but personhood inherently subordinates women to their fertilized eggs. It turns women into second or third class citizens. How do people who believe in personhood square that with equality? Remember what all persons born in the United States are supposed to get, right? Well, not you. Interestingly enough, let's say the answer is that you really do see a fertilized egg as a human being like any other, fundamentally no different from a 12-year-old child or an adult. People who are opposed to abortion compare that fertilized egg to other people they think are being discriminated against, or who the government or the Constitution has said are discriminated against. And they see abortion, or the destruction of embryos through other means like IVF, as being the most violent kind of discrimination, one that doesn't recognize the fetus's or embryo's basic humanity. They see an analogy to slavery, because slaves were also deemed to be less than human. Next question posed this way. It's so interesting that this idea of fetal personhood was starting to take hold among abortion opponents in the 1960s and 70s, at the same time when so many other movements for equality were also happening. Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. Well, the short crude history, the answer reads, is that personhood began as a sort of strategic necessity in the 1960s, when abortion opponents were starting to lose struggles in the states about abortion reform. Anti-abortion leaders were desperately trying to find a better way to talk about abortion, and they landed on the idea that it's unconstitutional to reform abortion laws because fetuses are persons and should be treated that way under the 14th Amendment. During earlier anti-abortion movements, it would have been really weird to talk about fetal personhood or rights. I mean, in the 19th century, people were just starting to make arguments about personhood and rights for enslaved people. But in the 1960s, equality and rights were very much part of the zeitgeist. So to some degree, anti-abortion leaders were doing what a lot of other social movements were doing in that era, when everybody was claiming to be the next civil rights movement. But in asserting that the fetus is a victim of discrimination, anti-abortion people were forced to talk about discrimination differently from how other people were talking about it at the time. Instead of thinking about discrimination as a legacy of historical oppression, which was becoming the main paradigm in the U.S., what abortion opponents landed on was the idea that the real victims of discrimination are people with disabilities, the elderly, and unborn children, because they are physically unable to protect themselves. That changed as conservatives rethought equality in other contexts. Over time, the anti-abortion movement gravitated more and more to the idea that the primary victim of discrimination in America was the victim of a crime. In the beginning, next question says, some supporters took a surprisingly benign approach to how fetal personhood ideas should play out in policy. And that's not a question, that's a statement. But okay, and the answer to the non-question. Early on, there was an argument that honoring personhood would require things like better health care during pregnancy, right? And better services for new parents. There was an acknowledgement that if you're going to care about a fetal person, you also have to address the reasons that women might seek abortion. But by the end of the 1980s and 90s, next question becomes, personhood was associated with a very pro-punishment ethos. What happened there? Well, by that time, the anti-abortion movement had pretty much aligned with the Republican Party, which was very much in the middle of engineering changes that would lead to mass incarceration. It was not going to be productive to talk about fetal rights in terms of expanding the social safety net. The movement itself also was changing. The dominant strain was now conservative Protestantism, and the new leadership more often shared that kind of pro-punishment perspective. Those ideas about helping pregnant patients never entirely went away, but they were pushed to the margins. At first, the movement put its hopes on getting a personhood amendment into the U.S. Constitution. Unsurprisingly, that didn't work. So by the 1980s and 90s, anti-abortion groups were looking for other ways to seed the idea of fetal personhood into the law. Most often, they did it in ways that appealed to Republicans. For example, making it a homicide to kill a fetus during the commission of another crime, allowing parents to sue for a fetus's wrongful death, and criminalizing drug use during pregnancy. But then anti-abortion leaders also worried that the movement was starting to look anti-woman, particularly as clinic violence and murders of abortion providers spiked in the 1990s. That led to them saying, well, the reason you don't punish women for having an abortion is because they don't know what they're doing. And you began to see them writing up their ideas about fetal rights and personhood into informed consent laws, and then punishing the providers who don't give women this information. Next question. Why do we sometimes think of the anti-abortion and personhood fights as different movements? Do we? We may. I don't know. Let's think about this. The answer, what happened was that some anti-abortion advocates were becoming really frustrated with the pace of change. Starting in Colorado in 2008 and then spreading elsewhere, they began promoting state constitutional amendments enshrining fetal rights. The media narrative was, there's this thing called the personhood movement that is so fringy, mainstream and anti-abortion groups don't support it. It's even losing in Mississippi. But if you dig into what they're fighting about, the mainstream group said, this is the wrong time. They were afraid that the U.S. Supreme Court would strike down these ballot measures and maybe even strengthen abortion rights in the process. So this was not a disagreement about substance. It was a disagreement about strategy. And I think that's still where we're at. Next question. Flash forward to 2025, and the fetal personhood movement has been grinding along for 60 years, making vast inroads in the law. What has been the reaction among mainstream reproductive rights groups? On the abortion rights side, a few people and organizations like Pregnancy Justice have been talking about personhood for some time. And of course, abortion groups opposed the personhood ballot measures. But most people were fixated on saving Roe. In some ways, that made strategic sense because with Roe in place, anti-abortion groups couldn't execute their broader plans for personhood. But there wasn't enough of a conversation about why personhood might be dangerous. Obviously, since Dobbs was handed down, the sense of what's realistic has changed accordingly. But for a long time, it was pretty unimaginable for a lot of people that the Supreme Court would undo Roe, much less continue to go further. Next question is, and when repro folks did talk about issues like personhood and pregnancy, it was often in ways that seemed overly intellectualized and a little clueless. You know, it's not a baby, it's a clump of cells. It's not a heartbeat, it's cardiac activity. It's just going to lead me down the abundance agenda debates. I don't know. I can't tell. I still don't know what the hell that thing is. Anyway, a lot of Americans who are not particularly progressive or particularly invested in this debate don't experience pregnancy that way, even a very early pregnancy. On the repro side, I think there was a certain amount of dismissing some of the ways that pregnancy is really complicated for people, emotionally and intellectually. Reproductive justice advocates sometimes did a good job of capturing this nuance, but it didn't always come across in broader political conversations. Next question. Since Dobbs, the rhetoric around personhood has become much more extreme. For example, so-called abortion abolitionists arguing that women should be arrested and prosecuted for having abortions. If anti-abortion people all agree that personhood is important, what don't they agree on? Okay. They're disagreeing either about how you get to personhood or what personhood means when you get there. The abolition movement is part of the personhood movement, but they very much believe the 1990s idea that we don't punish women who get abortions because women don't know what they're doing was a grave mistake, because most women do know what they're doing. In their view, if the anti-abortion movement is serious about the idea that a fetus is a person just like any other, then we can't avoid punishing women because we punish women for any other homicide. And other anti-abortion groups are saying, hold on, punishing women is so disastrously unpopular that even a movement that's willing to do things that are already pretty unpopular thinks it's a bridge too far. What do personhood advocates want? She's asked. Do they want Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale? This is a serious question. I keep wondering about the end point. Answer: it's fair to say that people in the abolitionist wing have very traditional views on gender and parenting. Many of them have, even by the standards of religious conservatives, exceptionally large families and very traditional ideas about masculinity. So their answer about what they want would probably reflect those extremes. As for the rest of the personhood movement, I don't know if they've worked it all out. That's not unusual for social movements. For example, progressives will say, we want universal public health care, or access to abortion without limits, or universal basic income, or a complete end to climate change. And everyone agrees, yeah, that'd be great. And then in the next breath, but that's totally not going to happen. To some degree, this is the dog that caught the car, not in the sense that the anti-abortion movement doesn't want personhood, but the fall of Roe happened so fast. Before Dobbs, personhood could just be the rallying cry. It didn't have to be practical. Now it does, and you're starting to hear people saying, well, that's not what personhood means. That's not what I'm fighting for. I didn't vote for that. I thought we were only deporting gangs. Sounds familiar. Your book makes a sobering case for the long-term strength of the personhood movement. Is it possible to reverse this trend? As a legal concept, it feels very advanced. And the answer, it's true that personhood already has a lot of anchoring in law, but it has very little popular support. That said, what happens next with fetal personhood largely depends on what kind of democracy we have. I was waiting to get to this question. Are voters the ones who get to decide, or will it be the judiciary or someone else? To the extent that it's the judiciary, what will the federal courts look like? It's true that we have to be ready with good legal arguments against personhood when the moment comes, but it's also important to make sure this is a question that regular people have the power to decide, and not just something that's directed to parts of our government that don't have to be responsive to what the people want. Good point. In addition to protecting our broader democratic rights, what else should people on the repro side be doing to prevent fetal personhood from making further inroads into our laws and politics? Good question. I think it's incumbent on people who support reproductive rights both to explain why they're opposed to personhood laws and strategies, and to say, and here's how we're going to care about pregnancy. Not just the pregnant person, but the fetal life too. It would be helpful for reproductive rights groups to think about a way to talk to those Americans who want to think of themselves as valuing fetal life, who also don't feel comfortable with some of what that's leading to. It's not enough to say fetal personhood erases the personhood of the mother and leave it at that. Let's take the example of legislation requiring the payment of child support for a fetus during pregnancy. That's an idea a lot of people might instinctively feel attracted to. It's also part of a strategy to recognize a version of fetal personhood that's very carceral in ways that I don't like. But if you just say, this is going to lead to the bad thing without an alternative, that risks sounding either callous or unplugged from the way many people view the emotional complexity of pregnancy and pregnancy loss. More basically, I think it might be helpful for people on our side not just to say that personhood is a silly thing to talk about, but to talk about what it means to them. Like, what does personhood from the perspective of a pregnant person look like? At the most fundamental level, we should be making it easier for people to talk about the full experience of pregnancy and all its complexity. The reproductive rights. The repro side shouldn't be letting the other side set the terms of the debate. That's the extent of the edited conversation here with the book author. But very interesting, and it still remained a side point to it all. But it is an interesting question. You got to make a decision about, or fight to have the kind of democracy you need to settle this question in your favor. It's not enough to be convinced of the rightness of your policy position if the decision is taken out of your hands, and in particular, if your decision is taken out of your hands and put in the hands of a group handpicked to oppose your position, and ask them to settle the question for you. So a very good point, and thanks for sharing it. Lambs and Beds for bringing this to our attention. Excellent fodder for a little bit of time away from the microphone. This might be an opportunity to sneak in a little bit about Curtis Yarvin, who I hate to acknowledge at all, but every once in a while I feel like you should be brought up to speed on what he's doing, or what dumb things he's saying, or something like that, just to remind you that there is such a tragic and stupid figure looming out there somewhere. We may have tried to run through part of this on the air at one point because the temptation is overwhelming to tell you about what crazy thing he's thinking about at any given time, but we usually run out of time for it. But let's see what happens here. This is, what are we looking at here? A Substack style offering, The Nerd Reich. I'm pretty sure we've tried to read this before, and I don't know if we've read other selections from it. I think this is the one we tried to do. Gil Duran is the writer here, and this goes back to April 7th, so, it's starting to age a little bit. But I think we tried it once. Let's give it a shot this time now. Unbounded by time, except for, well, not really. But anyway, Curtis Yarvin fears his authoritarian fantasy is flopping, which it is, and it should be, and I don't know why he should fear that. But I root for it every day. Dark Enlightenment guru, oh boy, sees his desired revolution unraveling under the weight of its own stupidity. That certainly feels true and sounds familiar. So let's give this another shot, shall we? The point. It begins here. That's the subheader of this section. The point. Yarvin sees doom and failure ahead. Right, so why listen to him? The accelerated destruction of the United States, the global economy, and the modern liberal democratic order is underway. Yet Curtis Yarvin, Peter Thiel's house philosopher, who has been advocating such extremism for years, is disappointed. The San Francisco software programmer behind the so-called Dark Enlightenment doesn't seem to be enjoying the fruits of his own revolution. In fact, he sees failure ahead. Yay! The backstory. Why would anybody say something this stupid? Fear and loathing in Washington, D.C. That's the backstory. It's April 2025. It was when he wrote this anyway. And President Elon Musk, the CEO dictator of the United States, is busy dismantling government. Oh, well, he's out now, I think, maybe. This demolition comes straight out of Yarvin's playbook, which calls for a CEO dictator to conduct a mass purge of the government's employees. Though regarded by many as a mere internet troll, sure. Yarvin, who Vice President J.D. Vance, who was also regarded as an internet troll, affectionately calls a reactionary fascist and often quotes, is now getting his due. Although, no, I think being shoved into a locker or maybe a wood chipper would be getting his due, but he's getting this instead. His extreme theories on replacing democracy with corporate dictatorship are finally being tested in Washington. The Financial Times, the New York Times, and Time Magazine, anything that has time in it apparently, have all paid homage to his role in shaping our current reality, but there's a problem. Yarvin is unfulfilled. Musk's destruction of government apparently does not meet the vaunted Dark Enlightenment guru's standards. Things are actually hard, huh? What do you know? In fact, he gives the effort a mediocre grade and says it will likely fail. And then I guess some quote from him from somewhere. After 6 weeks, is Trump 47 going well? It is and it isn't. Frankly, I give it a C-. While still far below its potential, it at least has not failed, which is frankly amazing. What is frustrating about this administration is that it has the opportunity to win, the strength to win, but neither, it seems, the will nor the understanding to win. You got to have his big brain involved, you see. So it's going to lose, but it's not not yet fated to lose. The key issue, Yarvin doesn't think Musk has the competence to carry out a revolutionary transformation of the American government. Not only can Elon not manage an operation on this basis, God himself could not manage it. He writes, though Curtis Yarvin surely could. Despite the ongoing destruction in Washington, Yarvin complains it's simply not enough. Unless the spectacular earthquakes of January and February are dwarfed in March and April by new and unprecedented abuses of the Richter scale, what is he even saying? He's a street corner lunatic. The Trump regime will start to wither and eventually dissipate. It cannot stay at its current level of power, which is too high to sustain, but too low to succeed. It has to keep doing things that have never been done before. As soon as it stops accelerating, it stalls and explodes. This should be read in Professor Frink voice, if I could do that. I don't know. Glavin, I got no idea. Yarvin is a long-winded writer. This paragraph comes from a bloated 7,000-word monstrosity titled Barbarians and Mandarins, published on March 6th. A competent editor would slash it by 90%, maybe more. Ironically, he's out there screaming for efficiency, right? The essay brims with false dichotomies, logical inconsistencies, half-baked metaphors, and allusions to genocide. It careens from Romanian tractor factories to Harvard being turned into dust, into quarks, with the coherence of a meth-addled squirrel. Yarvin's fetish for authoritarian governance matches his prose. Undisciplined, self-indulgent, and ultimately impotent. But I digress. Next up, analysis. 3 causes of Yarvin's disappointment. And I must have access to my disappointment music here somewhere, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, but that is not how this works. And it's just not going to happen for you. All right, well, the 3 causes of Yarvin's disappointment. Allow me to summarize Yarvin's whiny gobbledygook in 3 main points. 1, he's upset that Musk/Trump aren't being authoritarian enough. Yes. While most Americans are shocked by how the current administration is breaking norms, Yarvin thinks it's a middling effort. He wants full dictatorship as long as he gets his way. Of course, first, the government needs to be run top down from the Oval Office. This is why we call it the executive branch. Not really. Executive is a literal synonym of monarchical. No, it isn't. From mono, meaning one, and archy, meaning regime. Autocratic is fine, too. The executive branch is the autocratic branch, or should be if English is English. Libs, if these words don't mean what they mean, what do they mean? Well, they've taken on a much different meaning. What can I tell you? The executive branch, well, gee whiz. It's now in common usage, but there's checks and balances that have nothing to do with the etymology of the word. And bringing a dictionary to the Supreme Court ordinarily doesn't do you any good, okay? You can't stand there. Well, a good lawyer can't stand there and say, well, Merriam-Webster defines liberty as... No, it doesn't work that way. This is exactly what the author here is talking about. It's just these stupid, logical, I don't know, brain fart things that he thinks he's being incisive. According to Yarvin, power creates power. So there you go. The more power you use, the more you have. In his view, half measures are worse than nothing at all. Musk/Trump must increase the severity of, quote, things that have never been done before, unquote, or watch their regime wither and eventually dissipate. The real point, he declares, is to take power from the libs, then keep it. Apparently, Musk/Trump are falling short. Unless the monarch is ready to actually genocide the nobility or the masses, he has to capture their loyalty, or, in liberal parlance, obtain their consent. That's just how it works. You're not going to foam these people. What the f are you talking about? Like turkeys with bird flu, right? What? That means your only option is to convince them to love you, right? Well, what if it's not right? Notice the casual mention of genocide. For good measure, he links to the Wikipedia entry for foam depopulation. Foam depopulation, or foaming, is a means of mass killing farm animals by spraying foam over a large area to obstruct breathing and ultimately cause suffocation. It is usually used to attempt to stop disease spread. Yarvin has a penchant for evoking frames of genocide and violence. Even though he looks like a guy who'd surrender his lunch money with nary a whimper, he stops short of calling for literal genocide, but keeps reaching for the language of it. Mass death, institutional purging, systemic annihilation. And he rarely seems to notice or care just how grotesque that really is. More on this in the next section. 2, he thinks the entire system needs to be, quote, cremated and then rebuilt, not reformed. No, can never be reformed. Got to be rebuilt. Yeah. Disrupt. Whatever. Yarvin has no patience for simple budget cuts and bureaucratic layoffs. He wants total destruction, followed by radical rebuilding, or something like that. DC does not need better policies, he insists. It needs a complete reboot, as complete as the denazification of Germany in 1945. For example, every existing institution of science, outside the scientists and the labs themselves, must be fully cremated in a nuclear autoclave. Okay, sure, duh. Again, with the flippant use of violent imagery. First foaming, now crematories. Are we talking about a Holocaust? Yarvin again uses a mass murder metaphor to describe the firing of employees at the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health. Yeah, that's pretty Holocausty there, dude. Someone in Dodgy hacked the law. Hacking is good. Taking drastic actions is good. By realizing that a certain class of administrative employees in NSF and NIH, so-called probationary employees, could be legally shot without a trial. A review of unused drainage ditches in Bethesda showed adequate access capacity. Dodgy acted. The customer service records show few or no complaints about seepage, odors, etc. Seepage and odors. Not only does Yarvin use a killing metaphor to describe the fates of federal employees. Play act much. He also fantasizes about them rotting in mass graves. A healthy mind does not do such things, and these regular invocations of death and violence say much about Yarvin. He bathes his brain in the putrefying flesh of his imaginary bureaucrats. Oh, and in a positively flaming Freudian backflip, his parents were career federal employees. Yarvin contradicts himself often. For example, he wants everything nuked, buildings included. Yet he's oddly miffed that Musk and Trump want to shut down the Department of Education. Why do you want to shut down the Department of Education? Don't you want to be the one writing the Dear Colleague letters? Doesn't education in the U.S. need to be completely rebooted from kindergarten to university? How else are you going to do that except with all the dotted lines that come out of the Department of Education? I don't even know what you're talking about. Apparently, it's very frustrating to be a reactionary fascist theorist without also being a reactionary fascist dictator. If you want authoritarianism done right, you must do it yourself. Now here's section 3. He's learning that revolutionaries make terrible administrators. After years of theorizing about the overthrow of democracy, Yarvin has discovered that turning theory into practice is much harder than it looks. Those of us with experience in government and politics already knew this. Getting a single, simple change can take years. Overthrowing the entire U.S. government? Not a task for addled, inarticulate amateurs. Yarvin seems shocked that Musk, with zero government experience except for a reliance on government contracts, is doing such a poor job. He also seems chagrined at Trump's specific actions, like tariffs, which are throwing markets into chaos. In political terms, the whole thing is a total disaster. By early 2025, millions of Americans are marching in the streets, and even Republican voters are showing up at town halls to express seething anger. Yarvin seems to have come to a stark realization. If Musk/Trump failed to destroy the democratic system, extreme anti-government pseudo-intellectuals may face a bleak future. He urgently warns them against half-assing the revolution and reveals his own fear of what might happen when the pendulum swings in the other direction, saying, "But in the end, it is the road toward winding up in the foam yourself, probably with me for all my troubles." This is what usually happens to right-wing intellectuals, actually. Is it good? Good. Conclusion, Yarvin fears the foam. Yarvin sees his desired revolution unraveling under the weight of its own stupidity. He pines for intensified destruction, but it's not clear that that will happen, at least not to the extent he considers necessary, so in creeps the fear. In early 2025, Yarvin is coming to terms with the towering mediocrity of his ideas. His complaints about the CEO dictator system prove exactly why it's inferior to American democracy. Despotism is a dog with no name. Once you let it go, you can't call it back. Ironically, Yarvin may soon find himself grateful for the very institutions, democracy, bureaucracy, and laws that he enjoys deriding. Our liberal system, imperfect as it may be, does not stack a citizen in mass graves for having terrible ideas. Could happen by accident, but you never know. The only foam Yarvin needs to fear is the flecks in the corner of his mouth. May they serve as a cruel reminder of the hysteria that led him there. All right. I mean, it doesn't reveal a great deal about it, but if you go in depth and really read this nonsense that comes out of Yarvin. Oh, first of all, 7,000 words. You're never going to do it, right? Anyway, just a reminder, He is every bit the street corner lunatic and internet troll that you always suspected he was.
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
That will do it for today's episode of the pre-recorded Kagro in the Morning. Hope that tides you over for Monday. We're pre-recorded again Tuesday and Wednesday, back live on Thursday. Stay tuned now, of course, for Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy right here on Netroots Radio.